headquarters today, asking wider and faster testing of AIDS-fighting drugs. Even as police were making arrests, the government announced a significant change in policy. More on this from CBS News medical correspondent Susan Spencer.
Storm the NIH!
Mounted police and others wearing rubber gloves confronted about 1,000 AIDS activists this morning at the National Institutes of Health, home of government research on AIDS. Police arrested 81, many for occupying the Office of AIDS Drug Development, which protesters said doesn't live up to its name.
The bottleneck is human testing, human trials. They're just not testing enough of the promising new drugs and getting them out the door.
The process does not work. The process stinks.
Although the timing may have been accidental, today the government proposed changing the process. Under a new system, AIDS patients who either can't take conventional drugs or who have run out of options would be allowed to use unapproved experimental drugs before tests even showed they work.
The people who will benefit the most are people who are most severely affected by the disease.
It's a very important signal to the community that the federal government is serious about AIDS research and very serious about getting experimental treatments to people who need them as quickly as possible.
NIH officials say there are at least a dozen drugs that soon may qualify for use under the new system, but they don't expect that to quiet critics.
If you're sick, or you're dying, or you have a loved one that's sick or dying, there is no such a thing as fast enough. Fast enough means when you have all of the answers.
The new policy means that even without all the answers, the government finally has agreed with AIDS activists that patients with so little to lose have a right to take unproven drugs as long as they understand the risks. Susan Spencer, CBS News, Washington.
This is a major day of protest by AIDS activists in this country, 1,000 of them converging on the National Institutes of Health outside of Washington, demanding more research on the disease. 81 were arrested. NBC Science correspondent Robert Bazell has more tonight on a group that is taking the AIDS struggle to the streets and beyond that.
Today's demonstration is the latest of many staged by the militant group ACT UP, which has gained increasing influence on AIDS policy. The weekly meetings of the New York chapter attract hundreds, and the loosely knit organization counts 10,000 members nationwide, mostly young, mostly gay.
Let's do a big demonstration there and keep it there.
The atmosphere at the meetings and at the group's headquarters is characterized by enthusiasm and belligerence toward established institutions. Playwright Larry Kramer started ACT UP to accelerate the AIDS drug approval process.
What right does the FDA and the NIH have to tell a dying person what he or she can do with her or his body?
ACT UP's tactics often offend. Many Catholics were angered by this demonstration at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York to criticize the church's opposition to homosexuality and condoms. Sometimes the group attacks individuals. ACT UP proclaimed that former New York City Health Commissioner Stephen Joseph was more dangerous than the AIDS virus.
Well, I think their goals are the right ones, and their tactics are very much the wrong ones. It's the brown shirt, stormtrooper, unwillingness to see any other point of view, and a willingness to condemn any other point of view as an evil one.
I am so sick of hearing about our tactics offending people. The Vietnam War was not ended by people being nice. Nice people walk into gas chambers.
ACT UP members do more than demonstrate. Mark Harrington has made himself an expert on AIDS, and he serves on an NIH advisory committee, even though he helped organize today's demonstration.
Well, I call that the inside-outside strategy that I think ACT UP does really well.
ACT UP's strategy has been enormously successful in getting the Food and Drug Administration to loosen the regulation of new drugs for AIDS. Now the activists are trying to force scientists to work faster to develop and test new treatments. In the past, scientists have strongly resisted such pressure. ACT UP thinks the scientists can be made to listen. Robert Bazell, NBC News, Bethesda.
Nearly 1,000 activists gathered outside the National Institutes of Health in suburban Washington today to demand the government step up the pace of AIDS research. One of the AIDS activists said the researchers act as if they're trying to cure the common cold rather than a deadly disease. More than 80 people were arrested, most of them for trespassing.
The National Institutes of Health is the government's major research center on fighting disease, and that's why some protesters made it a target for their rage, because there hasn't been a cure found for AIDS yet. And they say that not enough has been done to fight the secondary diseases that actually kill people who get AIDS. Laurel Fairworth reports.
ACT UP, or the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, wanted to make a dramatic statement, and they did. Today, 900 protesters decided to, in their words, storm the NIH, the National Institute of Health's main campus in Bethesda, Maryland. These activists believe they must shock the public into confronting the horror of AIDS and the desperate need to find a cure.
I'm here because my friends are dying, and there's more that could be done.
Protesters are incensed by what they perceive as foot-dragging by the NIH. This group demands to know why, 10 years into the AIDS epidemic, only one antiviral drug, AZT, is on the market.
We're letting them know. I mean, we're paying tax dollars for this garbage. It's ridiculous. The bureaucracy, and people are dying. You can't let this happen.
NIH's director, Dr. Anthony Fauci, counters saying the center spends most of its time and 10% of its entire budget, or $800 million, on AIDS research.
To have a drug that isn't a cure, but that is quite effective in prolonging the lives of people who have AIDS, or preventing the onset of AIDS in people who are infected, is a remarkable accomplishment that, quite frankly, is unprecedented in the history of biomedical research.
For the most part, the crowd was orderly. But when dozens of people crossed police lines, they were arrested, charged with trespassing. And this man was hauled into custody after putting up a banner. Activists say they're willing to go to jail because silence means death. Demonstrators here say they will continue these acts of civil disobedience to keep AIDS in the national spotlight. Laurel Fairworth, Fox News, Channel 5.
AIDS activists who say red tape is in the way of finding a cure for AIDS are directing their anger now toward the National Institutes of Health. About 900 protesters descending on NIH headquarters today, with police making more than 80 arrests before the day was over. Mark Mooney has the story.
AIDS activists stormed the government's premier disease research center. The National Institutes of Health is where an AIDS cure might be found. It is where therapies are being tested in clinical trials. And yet more than 1,000 protesters, many of whom claim to be dying of AIDS, nearly brought research to a halt today.
No more secret meetings! No more secret...
Demonstrators blocked access to buildings. Scientists and administrators reporting to work stood around looking confused until police moved in to disperse the crowd, arresting an estimated 60 protesters. Activists charged the Bush administration with foot-dragging on AIDS research. It's not the amount of federal money allocated to it, so much as how research priorities are defined.
We need new drugs to keep people alive, but the NIH is only testing old drugs that we already have.
Like AZT, the only anti-AIDS drug that has gotten the approval of the Food and Drug Administration. AZT has proven to extend the lives of people dying of AIDS, but gay leaders want the federal government to move other known test drugs more quickly into trials.
I think their attitude was, who needs the faggots?
Joe Bachert and other AIDS patients warn Americans who think AIDS is still just a gay disease to think again.
We have blacks and Hispanics, IV drug users, who are walking around out there and don't even know they're positive, who are passing the disease unwillingly, unknowingly.
Today's protest action was hardly blunted by last week's announcement by the Public Health Service that experimental drugs would be made available to people unable to take part in conventional trials. The two-track system, as it's called, would deliver new drugs to the neediest patients whose disease is most advanced. What's so remarkable about today's demonstration is that beneath the shrill rhetoric lies some consensus. An agreement, however slim, among activists, industry, and government that the dying deserve every chance they can get to suffer less and live longer. At NIH, Mark Mooney, Washington.
AIDS activists turned their anger on the National Institute of Health today. Listen. Nearly 1,000 people demonstrated outside the NIH in Bethesda, Maryland. The activists say that the government research focuses too much on AZT and only federally approved drug to fight AIDS is currently in use. They want more research into a new antiviral drug and many more like it, and more emphasis on the infections that often kill patients. More than 80 protesters were arrested.